The kitchen timer chimed softly as Margaret pulled the orange cake from the oven, its golden surface gleaming under the afternoon light streaming through her Chicago apartment windows. The sweet aroma of vanilla and citrus filled the cramped space. A comforting ritual she'd maintained for 30 years. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of cooking and caring, carefully set the pan on the cooling rack. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of her modest Lincoln Park neighborhood, where gentrification crept closer each year, like an unwelcome visitor. The doorbell's harsh buzz shattered the peaceful moment. Margaret's heart clenched as she opened the door to find her granddaughter, Elisa, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, school uniform wrinkled backpack hanging limply from one shoulder. The 15-year-old collapsed into her grandmother's arms, without a word, her small frame shaking with silent sobs that spoke louder than any explanation could. "What happened, sweetheart?" Margaret whispered, stroking Elisa's auburn hair, the same shade that had once been her own. But even as she asked, she recognized the particular pain in her granddaughter's eyes, the ache of being ridiculed for doing what's right. It was a pain Margaret knew intimately, carved into her soul by years of choosing compassion over conformity. Through broken sentences and gasping breaths, Elisa's story emerged like water through a cracked dam. That morning she'd encountered an elderly homeless man shivering outside Preston Academy, Chicago's most prestigious private school. While her classmates hurried past, chattering about weekend plans and designer handbags, Elisa had stopped. She'd unwrapped her cashmere scarf, a birthday gift from her parents, and placed it around the stranger's shoulders. The ridicule had been swift and merciless. Cell phone cameras captured her act of kindness, transforming it into digital ammunition for teenage cruelty. Within hours, the videos circulated through social media with mocking captions, "Saint Elisa saves the day," and "Grandma's little helper strikes again." The comments section became a cesspool of privileged teenagers, parroting their parents' disdain for society's forgotten. Margaret held her granddaughter tighter, feeling the familiar fire of indignation kindle in her chest. She'd raised Elisa to see humanity in everyone, to understand that dignity wasn't determined by circumstances. Now that very compassion had made her a target. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. In a world desperate for kindness, they punished those brave enough to offer it. "They called me stupid, Grandma," Elisa whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "They said I was wasting my scarf on garbage, but he looked so cold in his eyes. They reminded me of someone, but I couldn't remember who." Margaret's blood ran cold. Something in Elisa's description, the location, the timing, the haunting familiarity in her granddaughter's voice, sent alarm bells ringing through her mind. But she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on comforting the trembling girl in her arms. Some coincidences were too painful to acknowledge even to herself. The next morning brought no relief. Margaret walked Elisa to school, watching her granddaughter's shoulders hunch with each step toward the imposing brick building. Other students whispered and pointed, their privileged faces twisted with the casual cruelty that money couldn't buy, but somehow always seemed to afford. Parents dropped off their children in luxury cars, their conversations peppered with casual dismissals of those people and what's wrong with kids today. Standing at the school gates, Margaret observed the social ecosystem that had wounded her granddaughter. She recognized the type. Wealthy families who wore their charity work like designer accessories perfectly polished for public consumption, while privately teaching their children that compassion was conditional. These were people who donated to homeless shelters from the comfort of their gated communities, never allowing themselves to see the individual faces behind the cause. The school principal, Mrs. Hartford, emerged from the building with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Mrs. Chen," she said, using Margaret's married name with forced warmth, "I understand there was some social media activity yesterday. We're monitoring the situation." Margaret studied the woman's face, reading the subtext beneath her diplomatic words. The school wasn't concerned about the bullying. They were worried about their reputation. "My granddaughter showed kindness to someone in need," Margaret said quietly. "I'm failing to see the problem." Mrs. Hartford's smile tightened. "Of course we admire Elisa's generous spirit, But perhaps we could discuss more appropriate ways for her to express her charitable impulses. We have several approved volunteer opportunities that might better suit a student of her standing. The condescension in her tone made Margaret's hands clench into fists. Appropriate ways. Student of her standing. The euphemisms couldn't mask the ugly truth. Elisa's compassion was acceptable only when it was sanitized, organized, and safely distant from the school's pristine image. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She sat in her small living room surrounded by 30 years of memories and picked up her phone. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through her contacts, searching for numbers she hadn't dialed in years. The weight of the secret she'd carried pressed against her chest, like a stone making each breath an effort. Finally, she found the first name, David Kim. Once a scrawny 12-year-old who'd spent countless afternoons in her kitchen, now the CEO of a major tech company. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, though deeper, now shaped by years of success and responsibility. "Mrs. Chen, is everything all right?" The immediate concern in his tone reminded her of the boy he'd once been, always worried about everyone else's well-being. "David," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about Raphael, about what happened to him." The silence on the other end of the line stretched like a chasm. Finally, David spoke, his voice tight with emotion. "We wondered why he disappeared. We tried to find him, but he's been on the streets for 3 years," Margaret said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Living rough, struggling with demons I couldn't pull him away from. And yesterday my granddaughter, she helped him. She gave him her scarf and now she's being destroyed for it." The story poured out of her like water through a broken dam. Years of Raphael's decline, her failed attempts to help, the pain of watching someone she loved disappear into the shadows of society. David listened without interruption, absorbing every detail with the careful attention he'd once given to her homework help sessions. When she finished, the silence stretched between them again. Then David's voice came through the phone, steady and determined. "Give me 48 hours, Mrs. Chen, and trust me." Margaret hung up the phone and stared at the wall where photos of Raphael's childhood smiled back at her. The boy who'd arrived at her door 24 years ago, abandoned and afraid, had become her son in every way that mattered. Now he was lost, and her granddaughter was paying the price for trying to save him. The next 2 days passed in a blur of whispered phone calls and careful planning. Margaret watched Elisa grow smaller and quieter, with each passing hour the light in her eyes dimming under the relentless pressure of her peers' cruelty. The videos had spread beyond their school, attracting comments from strangers who felt qualified to judge a 15-year-old's compassion. But Margaret had learned patience in her 73 years. She'd learned that sometimes the most powerful responses came not from immediate action, but from careful preparation. She'd also learned that the people who mattered most were often the ones who seemed to have disappeared from your life. Friday afternoon arrived with the crisp promise of autumn change. Margaret stood across the street from Preston Academy, watching the familiar chaos of dismissal time. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, parents checking their phones, while children emerged from the building in clusters of privilege and entitlement. Then she saw them. 3 black Mercedes sedans approaching slowly and deliberately, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun like mirrors. The first car pulled to the front of the line, followed by the second, then the third. The perfectly choreographed arrival sent ripples of curiosity through the assembled crowd. From the first car stepped David Kim, now 41 and commanding, in his tailored suit. His success was evident not just in his clothing, but in the confidence of his posture, the way he moved through the world as someone accustomed to being heard. From the second car emerged Marcus Washington, another of Margaret's former kitchen table regulars, now a prominent attorney whose community advocacy work had earned him citywide recognition. The third car held the most precious cargo. As its door opened, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Raphael emerged slowly, his familiar features now gaunt but clean, wearing the cashmere scarf that had started everything. His eyes, once bright with mischief and dreams, now carried the weight of hard years, but they were clear and focused. The schoolyard fell silent as the 3 men approached the building. Students pressed against windows, teachers stepped outside, and parents abandoned their phone conversations to stare at the unfolding scene. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she crossed the street, each step carrying her toward a moment she'd been preparing for without knowing it. "Excuse me," David's voice cut through the murmur of speculation. "We're here to speak with Mrs. Hartford and anyone else who might be interested in learning about the man you've been mocking." Mrs. Hartford appeared at the school's entrance, her professional composure cracking slightly at the unexpected development. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what this is about. If you'd like to schedule a meeting—" "This is about Rafael Martinez," Marcus said, his attorney's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to courtrooms. "The homeless man your students have been ridiculing online. The same man who, before circumstances changed his life, mentored dozens of children in this community." Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "This is my son," she said, placing her hand on Raphael's arm. "Not by birth, but by choice. 24 years ago, I took in a boy who had nothing. I fed him, clothed him, loved him, and he grew up to become someone who changed lives." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. Margaret saw Elisa emerge from the building, her face pale with confusion and recognition. Their eyes met across the gathered crowd, and Margaret smiled, the first real smile she'd felt in days. Raphael built 3 successful businesses before his world fell apart. David continued, his voice carrying across the silent schoolyard. He funded scholarships, mentored at-risk youth, and gave more than he ever received. The scarf he's wearing was a gift from a girl who saw his humanity when no one else would. Margaret watched the faces around her, seeing the shift from curiosity to discomfort, to something approaching shame. Parents who had laughed at their children's cruelty now found themselves confronting the reality behind their assumptions. Students who had participated in the online mockery suddenly understood the weight of their actions. "My granddaughter," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was ridiculed for showing kindness to someone in need. She was called stupid, naive, wasteful. But she did something most adults have forgotten how to do. She saw a human being and responded with compassion." Elisa pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she reached Raphael. "I knew your eyes looked familiar," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Grandma showed me your pictures, but I couldn't." Raphael knelt down. To meet her eyes, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted the scarf around his neck. "You saved me," he said simply, not just with warmth, but with dignity. "You reminded me that I'm still worth saving." The moment stretched between them, grandfather and granddaughter connected by a thread of compassion that had withstood years of separation and pain. Margaret felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she watched the reunion she'd dreamed of over 3 years. Mrs. Hartford cleared her throat, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine emotion. I think we owe some people an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And perhaps we need to have some conversations about kindness and assumptions." David stepped forward, his business card appearing in his hand like a magic trick. "We'd be happy to speak with your students about second chances, about not judging people by their circumstances. Sometimes the most important lessons can't be found in textbooks." As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret found herself surrounded by the most important people in her world. Raphael stood beside her, solid and real after years of worry and wondering. Elisa held his hand, her face glowing with the pride of knowing she'd done the right thing. David and Marcus flanked them like protective guardians, their success a testament to the power of second chances and unwavering support. The ride home was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of people who had found their way back to each other. Raphael sat in Margaret's small kitchen, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the same blend she'd been making for decades. The orange cake sat between them on the table, a bridge between past and present. "I never stopped loving you, Ma," he said, using the name he'd called her since childhood. "I just thought I wasn't worthy anymore." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard years. "I never stopped waiting," she replied. "This house has always been your home." That night, as Margaret tucked Elisa into bed, her granddaughter's eyes sparkled with a new understanding. "Grandma," she said softly, "I'm not sorry I gave him the scarf. Even if I'd known it would cause trouble, I'd do it again." Margaret kissed her forehead, her heart swelling with pride. "That's how I know you're going to change the world, sweetheart. One act of kindness at a time." In the weeks that followed, the story of the scarf spread through Chicago in ways that social media mockery never could. David Marcus and Raphael began speaking at schools throughout the city, sharing their stories of second chances and the power of seeing beyond circumstances. Preston Academy implemented new programs focused on community service and empathy education. Margaret returned to her quiet routines, but now they were filled with the sounds of family. Raphael helped with the cooking, sharing stories of his journey back to himself. Elisa brought friends home after school, young people who had learned that kindness was not weakness but strength. The orange cake continued to fill the apartment with its sweet aroma every Tuesday, but now it was shared by a family reunited by compassion and sustained by unconditional love. Margaret had learned that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, driven by love and wrapped in the warmth of a cashmere scarf. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has experienced being judged for showing kindness to someone society has forgotten? Share your story in the comments below. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret often stood at her kitchen window watching the snow fall on the busy Chicago streets below. She thought about the power of second chances, the importance of seeing beyond appearances, and the way love could triumph over circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. The homeless man who had shivered outside Preston Academy was gone, replaced by a son who was rebuilding his life one day at a time. The granddaughter who had been mocked for her compassion now stood as a beacon of hope for her generation. And the grandmother who had waited in silence for years had learned that sometimes the most profound victories come not from fighting battles, but from never giving up on the people we love. But the story was far from over. News outlets had picked up the tale of the scarf, the Mercedes, and the reunion that proved love could conquer even the darkest circumstances. Interview requests poured in, speaking engagements multiplied, and Margaret found herself at the center of a movement she'd never intended to start. The attention was overwhelming, but Margaret handled it with the same quiet dignity she'd always possessed. She spoke at community centers and corporate boardrooms, sharing the simple truth that had guided her life: every person deserves to be seen, valued, and loved, regardless of their circumstances. Raphael's transformation accelerated as he found purpose in sharing his story. The businesses he'd once built were gone, but the entrepreneur within him had not died. With David and Marcus as partners, he began developing a new venture, a social enterprise that provided job training and housing assistance for people experiencing homelessness. Elisa became the unlikely face of teenage activism, invited to speak at youth conferences about the power of individual action. Her message was, simple but profound kindness is never wasted, even when it seems to go unnoticed or unappreciated. The final chapter of their story unfolded on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after that first tearful reunion in Margaret's kitchen. The orange cake was in the oven, filling the apartment with its familiar sweetness, when the doorbell rang with news that would change everything once again. A letter had arrived from the Chicago City Council. Raphael's new organization had been selected to receive the city's first annual Humanitarian Innovation Award, recognizing their groundbreaking work in addressing homelessness. The ceremony would be held at City Hall, with Margaret and Elisa recognized as co-founders of the inspiration behind the program. As Margaret read the letter aloud, she felt the weight of their journey settling into something resembling peace. The pain they'd endured, the separation they'd survived, the mockery they'd faced, all of it had led to this moment of recognition and renewal. That evening, the 3 generations sat around Margaret's small dining table, sharing stories and dreams over slices of orange cake. The light from the kitchen window cast a warm glow over their faces, highlighting the resemblance between Raphael and Elisa that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with shared values and mutual love. "You know," Margaret said, setting down her fork and looking at the 2 people who had made her life complete, I used to think that justice was something that happened to other people in other places, but I've learned that justice is something we create one act of kindness at a time. Raphael nodded, his eyes bright with the hope that had been missing for so many years. Ma, you taught me that home isn't a place. It's people who love you unconditionally. I lost sight of that for a while, but I never forgot it completely. Elisa smiled, her face radiant with the confidence that comes from knowing you've made a difference. And I learned that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Even when people laugh at you, even when it costs you something precious, kindness always matters. Margaret reached across the table and took both their hands, in hers feeling the calluses and scars that told their individual stories of struggle and triumph. We've all learned that love doesn't give up, she said softly. It waits, it hopes, it endures. And sometimes when we least expect it, it shows up in a Mercedes to remind us that we're never truly alone. As the Chicago skyline twinkled outside, their window 3 generations of family, bound not by blood but by choice, not by perfection, but by persistence, shared the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had created something beautiful from the ashes of despair. The scarf that had started it all now hung in a place of honor in Margaret's living room, a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can unleash the most powerful forces of change. Their story had become more than just a tale of reunion and redemption. It had become a testament to the truth that hope is never truly lost, that families can be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest gestures of human compassion. The city continued to bustle outside, their windows full of countless stories of struggle and triumph, of kindness and cruelty, of people who had lost their way, and others who helped them find it again. But inside Margaret's warm kitchen, surrounded by the scent of orange cake and the sound of gentle laughter, 3 people who had found their way back to each other knew that they were exactly where they belonged. Congratulations, type 9 in the eye. Comment so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.